I think it's very important to be connected to nature for the basic notion that we are ourselves animals. The development of architecture over many years was done in what we call a capsule-like way. A lot of design went into insulating the system. So you can insulate and make a shell so tight that we can control the interior climate separately from the exterior climate. We go into these capsules and not have to breathe fresh air, I guess, sometimes, or even be able to open a window for this kind of capsule to perform. We demand a certain amount of air conditioning and comfort that some people say we've been taught to want as opposed to actually need. What that has done over time is it has made us even more separate from nature itself. Maybe our architecture should have developed in a more porous way over time. Maybe there's a balance between what we should have and how to make it using the most passive, natural means to do it. So this one actually, we call this self-assembly. We designed, I know this seems really crude, a very simple system that's a one-way system so that basically it won't go back to its original position. So you can see just by using, in this case very crudely, the screws as weights, we could make it build itself up to, I think it's about a 4-inch height, and not go back. We're working on several things for self-assembly. Hopefully it will ease construction so that you don't need to use any tools, as you can see. And for hard-to-reach areas, it can help build itself, in effect. It's funny because it leads to other things that we never anticipated, into construction underwater or construction in outer space, in areas that you don't have a lot of contractors there to help out, and a high cost to that kind of labor.
Doris is unusual and very unique and very special. She's combining her expertise in biology into her expertise in architecture, and it's creating a very fascinating way of approaching some of the problems we have in building design and construction that we haven't been able to solve, either because the technologies haven't caught up or because somebody like Doris didn't come into the profession yet.
The field of architecture has shifted greatly in the last century, particularly in the last 20 years. There's been shifts in taste and priority. Can you talk a little bit about what those things are?
When it comes to architecture, usually we're the last one to change. A lot of times new trends and ideas first are encountered in literature, in art. Architecture is a very interesting interdisciplinary profession because it isn't just an art, it's also a science. It's also shelter. So there are functional aspects of it, and then there are creative aspects of it.
This piece here was actually one of the first pieces that we worked on. It's, we call it armored corset. The idea is that as the temperature in the space rose, the surface would crimp and curl. It would allow air to pass through the surface. So it's more of a ventilating idea. Each piece is different and all the pieces vary relative to its neighbor. It was the first time we used the bimetal in a surface treatment. Thermal bimetal is the lamination of two metals together, and they're different alloys and therefore have different coefficients of expansion. So when the temperature rises, like all materials, they expand, and one side basically expands more than the other, and it's designed to do that.
Biometals and smart materials have become much more fascinating areas to experiment with. They're allowing us to combine new, innovative things that are being discovered in science on a pragmatic and practical level in buildings.
Oftentimes we try to figure out what the bimetal wants to do naturally, and from that try to make it do something additionally. So for example, it could curl simply, it could twist. It's not an easy thing because we're, like everything that you see here, we're trying to do it very passively, which means we're not using any electricity, we're not using any solar panels, we're not using any other means to make air move except by just basic physics. Architecture, we can't sense anything beyond the building, and so I thought maybe there's a way to make architecture more sensitive and responsive. As we're going and learning about global warming and climate change, I realized that the skin of architecture should be able to respond to the outside and the changes. I thought, well, if there's temperature changes and the sea level's rising and all these dramatic things are happening, how are we going to design our houses and our buildings to respond to that? And then eventually, with the emergence of things like smart materials that need no energy and no controls, it became evident to me that, well, we should be using these smart materials and not electricity and not computer controls to make our architecture operate and respond. My parents immigrated to the US in 1962. So they came at a very early time, and there were not a lot of Koreans here at the time to give them guidance on what to do. I was born here, as my two sisters were as well. We grew up at that time a Los Angeles that was predominantly Caucasian. And so we had a lot of different role models growing up that weren't part of our original culture. For example, my name actually came from Doris Day because my parents really liked Doris Day. So the idea of identity was a difficult thing growing up, and what I was supposed to do as a child of a Korean family in America, where the idea was very, very different. I assumed that I'd go to college to eventually work and have a career. But when I graduated, my parents told me that they didn't want me to work, and that a woman's place in Korean society was basically to be educated so that you can have kids and raise your kids. That was probably the first sign to me that things were going to be very, very different in my life than my parents' life. I went to college and I was pre-med, and I thought I was going to go to medical school, and I actually really did enjoy the maths and sciences at that time. I was advised to possibly consider a different major so that I would look different as an applicant. And I thought, oh wow, this is a really good idea. And so I went to Princeton, where we had a lot of other courses that we had to take as a liberal arts college. And one of them was architecture. So I thought, oh, okay, architecture seems like pretty good. Why not major in that? When I started taking the architecture classes and taking more and more classes in my major, they seemed very, very easy. I almost thought that at that time this was probably like what we called a gut major, something that would just be really easy to get through. And in retrospect, laugh about it and with a lot of my friends, because it actually isn't at all. If anything, and I didn't realize this at that very time, it was something that came easy to me because I think it was very natural, and I think it was part of eventually who I was and who I've become. I think it was in about 2008, BMW came out with a concept car called Gina. The idea was that depending on what speed it's going, the body of the vehicle would deform. And it would deform to improve the performance of the vehicle at that speed. The outer shell was actually made out of Lycra, and you can see insides and outside parts were all moving as if the vehicle was alive itself. When I saw that, I thought, well, here we go. You know, we have vehicles that can start to think about this thing. Why isn't our architecture doing the same?
Can you tell me about a project that of Doris's that really surprised you, that you were just like, I can't believe no one's tried that, or this is such a unique way of coming towards something?
Nothing surprises me about Doris.
Is a project that was our first outdoor application of the thermal bimetal, and the idea was that it would perform sort of like a sundial. And as the sun moved across the sky, you would actually hit certain areas on the surface, and that area would perform differently relative to that time of day. So when the light hits the surface, all the little pieces here, and again keep in mind there's about 9,000 bimetal pieces and another 4,000 or 5,000 aluminum pieces. But all these little pieces on the surface would curl up, and so in some cases it would allow light to penetrate while still shading from the sun.
It was almost like a flower, but it was a space, and it was beautiful.
Some of the things that we do, we try to mimic some plants and animal and fur and scales a little more. In this one, it was mostly just kind of the surface area of trying to look at in this early like fish scales and that kind of system to come up with a patterning. It can then start to, in a much easier way, become more like a biological element than ever before.
Think about what a building is. It's shelter. It's like clothing. And clothing is actually, there's an analogy of clothing to skin. There's an analogy of buildings to clothing.
If the actual skin on our body is the first, the clothing is their second, the third layer would actually be the architecture around it. And so if we think of these as almost radiating surfaces outside of our body, there's a big loss between that second and third one of sensitivity and responsiveness. Why couldn't architecture be more similar to clothing? Why couldn't it be responsive? Why couldn't it move? Why couldn't it be ergonomic and fit your body? Why we couldn't feel sensation through this material? So in clothing, even though this is inanimate material, you know, if you're tugging on my shirt, I can feel it. I can feel how hard you're tugging. When I'm walking on surfaces, I can tell the texture, all these types of things. But architecture, we can't sense anything, I mean, beyond the building. And so I thought maybe there's a way to make architecture more sensitive and responsive. I didn't have any preconceived ideas of what architecture should be. I didn't think, oh, an architect should do this and architecture should look this way. I decided to step out of the role of the typical architect and move more into research so that I can start to look at what other stuff we can bring and provide to architecture and how to make architects think a little differently about where we're going with architecture itself. There's no opportunity to just suddenly design a brand new city the way that you want it, right? Our city's already developed anywhere from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York. To have to change it is going to be dramatic, and the cost to it is stupendous. And the idea of what truly sustainability means is a real issue, because we can't just knock down our old buildings and just start all over and say that this is a smart way to move. I think a lot of people are starting to think about how we can actually implement these things over time. And as you start to see, which is kind of nice, the design and attention is put to what really is sustainable. We can't knock the building down. It's actually more sustainable to use and reuse what we have than to start all over again.
What's really cool about what she's doing is she's taking the results of some of what science is discovering and seeing if it can be used on a level that can solve some of our environmental issues.
You could clearly tell that she was a person that was thinking outside of the box. She was really trying to understand how to approach solutions in a very passive and new way.
She was the kind of professor that was always pushing you to be very independent in your thinking. With the work that we do, it's both like very exact, but also very freeing because we approach it from every angle because we want it to do a certain thing, but there's so many ways to do it.
Well, I tell my students always to walk around with your eyes wide open. And a lot of it is because you don't know where that inspiration is ever going to happen. It's from nature, it's from just walking down the street, it's just from someone who said something randomly. Even this piece, for example, itself, I can show you where it started from and the different iterations it went to, but it definitely was a surprise in the end that we'd build this and build a 40-foot tower out of it. The idea and the process is a morphing type of system. I also strongly believe that true creativity comes out of not knowing what the big picture is necessarily going to be. In a city, we have things called urban canyon. In these canyons, what happens is all the smog and the particulate matter sits at the very lowest level of these canyons between buildings. The highest level is where the cleanest air is. And the problem is this particulate matter has a very difficult time from escaping. At the same time, that's where all the pedestrians are. That's where all the vehicles are. That's where all the bus stops are and people waiting. And unfortunately, that's oftentimes where all the lower income people are too.
We've had a long history of building shelters. The problem with this long history is our buildings still leak. They're not perfect. There are problems with sunlight heating a space too quickly.
We're working on projects that would actually help for what we call public health. The proposal that I had that was funded by Rockefeller Foundation is to consider the outside or the facade of a building as a way to give back to the city, so that the design of that performatively would be to either cool down the city, to warm it up, to make air movement, to filter air, to do different things. The project that we're working on right now is trying to develop window systems, and they're auto-shading window systems. As you can imagine, in a lot of high-rise buildings, you can see the windows are tinted, and they're tinted like sunglasses. So the darker they are, the more sun they'll prevent from penetrating, but at the same time, from the inside looking out, the color spectrum is very, very limited. We're trying to get to a point where we can find a way to shade the sun from entering, reducing the amount of air conditioning necessary to cool the space, and also retain the highest amount of visibility through the system. In this case, the bimetal is pre-curled. As we heat it up, they reverse the curl and they flip over. I'll show you this. So you can see that they flip over, and if the sun is coming from this side, it blocks the sunlight as it goes in and adds a large amount of shade on the inside, and when it's cool, like today, it'll just go back again. And in this case, the sun will be able to go through and still heat up the interior in the wintertime. So it's a temperature-controlled window shading system. I'm one of those people who do compartmentalize a lot of my life, just because it doesn't blend that easily. You know, I have 3 kids and I raise 3 kids, but a lot of people at my work are surprised that I even have kids because I don't talk about them when I'm at work. In my industry, okay, so how do I say this? In architecture, it's predominantly male. And I never wanted to feel like I was treated differently. I really wanted it to be my work that resulted in where I was for merit.
There has been a history of female spaces and male object. This notion of sexuality, gender, and architecture isn't just on a level of how it permeates the actual creation of our environment. It also crosses into what women should be doing in design and architecture versus what they want to do.
About 15 years ago, I was introduced for an award, for a university award, and me and one other person got it. And this other professor was male, and he had 3 sons, the same age as my 3 girls. And when they introduced him, they talked about all his accolades, and so-and-so did this and this and this and this, and isn't he great? And he came up for his award. When they introduced me, they started out by saying, here's Doris Sung, mother of 3. And I thought, what does that have to do with getting this award for research, right? I think being raised in a family of 3 girls, the great thing is that there was no double standard. In the Korean culture, there is a lot of double standard, right? The men are treated much better than women in general, or historically, and are given a higher place in society. I had no brothers, so my father, coming from a patriarchal society, had nobody to shower all his attention on, and so he had to split it evenly between 3 girls. And so he also instilled in us probably a certain value system of hard work and diligence and excellence and perfection that we might not have gotten if we had a brother, actually.
Doris is exploring traditionally male-dominated areas of architecture, which are science, technology-related. She's become somewhat of a role model of where women architects can aspire to beyond the traditional definitions of a woman designer or architect.
A lot of younger architects, women, ask me how I did it or how I do it, and I never stop to think about it. I just do it because, it's the only way that I can do something I really enjoy. The role of an architect has to evolve. Instead of being limited by what architects should do, I started to really look at what architects can do.
Doris said something that was so fascinating to me. She said that true creativity comes from not knowing, and that is the crucial point, because otherwise you already have a preconceived notion that you probably got someplace else. It didn't come from inside you because you already knew what you wanted when you got started.
Innovation requires that you try to leave all your unconscious biases outside.
I tell my kids and my students too that you really want to have impact on this world here. I try to instill upon my students that you can find it. There's ways to find it, and it's not necessarily going to be that, oh, I know the answer to it suddenly. That little by little, as you whittle away at it, if you think of an algebraic problem with all these little steps, if you can just first answer that first step and then the second step and keep going through it, well, you finally get to an answer. Right now, there's a big concern for how millennials, for example, understand sustainability and how they're going to be the future and the next generation of pulling this together. I think the fulfillment in life, a lot of it is coming out of how you think what you do is meaningful. That alone can have enough impact to motivate you to do even more and to do bigger things and affect more people than just yourself. I think we're starting to do that now, though. I think people are starting to realize that that is more of the answer of where to go. But unfortunately, it's a matter of trying to now step back and look at the big picture and then move forward again.